Hello everyone, welcome to the Decktech for Redline Cindra. As of recording, this deck has now won 2 back-to-back callings, the Calling Memphis in the hands of Brodie Spurlock and the Calling Christchurch in the hands of Sean. So shout out to both of you, congrats on your wins, and yeah, excited to be talking about this deck. So Redline Cindra was a deck that I created and built. I had pretty much made the entire core, got a little bit of input on some of the D-React and Sideboard packages, but really this deck was sort of like my creation going into Memphis. I had built it both as a deck that I thought seemed fun and that I could make content on, but also one that I thought was pretty strong. And I think that the early success of the deck doesn't surprise me too much. Cindra is very aggressive. She punishes unrefined deck lists. She is hard to play against. She asks a lot of tough blocking decisions of your opponent, and if they make some mistakes, then they can really get punished and fall behind for that. So not surprised to see Cindra do well, and I think that she is a deck that is going to appeal to a wide range of players, both new players looking for a deck to pick up that is pretty forgiving and intuitive and easy to play, but also experienced players that really want to get every little inch out of this deck, sequence their on hits, really push mask and maximize that equipment. I think that there's a lot of nuance to this deck as well. So I think the deck is both easy to play but difficult to master, and just kind of a very fun deck. It's one of the most enjoyable decks I've played in quite some time. So yeah, I'm going to be talking all things Redline Cindra, give you an idea about all the card choices and the ideas behind it, and hopefully help you get ready for RTNs. If you're interested in getting more information about this that is not covered in this deck tech, you can check out our Patreon, patreon.com/onthebobble. I have a link down in the description below for that, as well as the Decklist. So on the Patreon, we have a how to play guide, as well as a sideboard guide with all the matchup notes that you'll need. So if that's something that interests you, feel free to check us out. And otherwise, we'll be moving on to the deck tech. So in terms of equipment, you have 3 main equipment: Blood Splattered Vest, Flick Knives, and Mask of Momentum. These are super synergistic and really work in harmony with another. So Mask of Momentum is probably the most important one, where if you hit with 3 attack actions in a row, you end up drawing a card. And, you know, pretty classic card. We've seen it in decks like Ira to force opponents to block, and if they don't block, you get to get card advantage, which is really good. But what makes this card even better, and has made it have a little bit of a resurgence in Classic Constructed, it fell off for a bit, is Flick Knives. So Flick Knives lets us once per turn flick a dagger. The dagger won't trigger a Mask of Momentum because it's not an attack action, but it does count that chain link as having hit. So let's suppose you present 3 chain links. They don't block the first one, they don't block the second one, they block on the third one. You flick, and then that chain link has hit. You don't draw the card, but that means on the 4th chain link, Mask of Momentum is still live because it looks for the 3rd or higher chain link in a row. So yeah, Mask of Momentum will still be live, and they have to essentially block 2 chain links to successfully block out Mask of Momentum, which is quite pesky. Finally, Blood Splattered Vest is kind of the thing that ties everything together. So whenever a dagger hits, you can gain a resource and put a stain counter on it, and if there's 3 or more stain counters on it, you destroy it. This is basically like a tunic counter that you have pretty much on demand thanks to Flick Knives, and this lets you sort of cheat. So the idea behind this deck is, what if we just play pitchless, and we get to play some of the 1 cost still, so Art of the Dragonfire, Breaking Point, etc. And one of the ways we're paying for these is with the Blood Splattered Vest, is that on-demand tunic counter. It really lets us do that. So these 3 equipment are really essential and kind of like make the deck hum. And then the kunais, of course, are pretty much just here to flick. We're not really swinging it. There's some exceptions. We can talk about that. But for the most part, the kunais just Flick Knives fodder. And Dragon Scalar Flight Path is here to give our draconic cards go again. With fealty, this can kind of give anything go again, and notably, this being an instant means that we can use it after the Mask of Momentum draw to see what the card is and then have full information. We also don't have to, like, sometimes with snaps, you commit snaps on the snatch, you hope that you draw the card, and if they have the D-React, you get kind of hosed. Here you could actually just wait, confirm the damage, confirm the card draw, make sure it's a card that you want to play, and then when you have full information, you can crack Dragon Scalar Flight Path. Just remember, only targets Draconics. So, yeah. So that's pretty much the equipment suite for Cindra. So some people might be asking, why Redline? The reason for the inspiration behind this was that the kunais, while they're pretty good, are basically Kodachis that you have to do a lot of work for. They do give you flick knife synergy, which is really, really good. But the fact that you have to play this mini game of like flicking them, and then you're like built to play to swing 2 kunais, but then if you can't flick one of the kunais with an effect other than flick knives, you only have 1 kunai at the end of the turn, and then you might not be able to spend all your resources, so you're like 1 point under rate. You have to draw blues as well as reds, so there's a little bit of inconsistency there. And then the big tipping point for me was just the Mistveil heroes coming in with Passover and banishing your daggers was really brutal for those decks. So I wasn't really too much of a fan of the blue pitch Cindra decks, the ones that like actually wanted to pitch blues and swing daggers. So instead, I wanted to explore Redline, and that's kind of where this deck was born. I think that going forward, if Mistveil rotates or isn't as prominent, with like Zen being close to Al and New and Enigma being up there as well, I could see a world where Cindra can maybe be played with some blue cards, and then you swing the daggers, and you can lean into some of the other synergies, especially with like Ice coming back in the future potentially. That could be needed. But right now, I think Redline is pretty much the way to go because the deck is just extremely, extremely consistent and very efficient as well. Okay, so the idea behind the deck is that you can play out your hands and convert them on offense very reliably. We play basically every draconic starter that costs 0 that we have access to, including yellow branded with Cinderclaw. So we're kind of just like really playing every single starter that we can. And the idea is that we can basically play a whole bunch of head jabs, use flick knives to push our on hits, and then ideally put these 4s, so some of our head jabs come in for 4. Ideally, we can put those on the chain link after our opponent commits a block. So if we go 3-3, and then our opponent blocks 3 on the second chain link, we can flick and then make them block a 4 on the third chain link. Similarly, if they don't block the 2 chain links, you can send another 3 on the third chain link. If they don't block it, if they block it, you flick knives, you present a 4. Make it really tricky for them to block. So that's a way that this deck can play. And of course, if you have more 4s, you can just make it even more difficult for your opponent to block, and you have some enders that come in for 5. So that's kind of the idea behind the deck and kind of the ethos of the deck. And really, most of your turn should be functioning around Mask of Momentum. You should be figuring out like how many times can you threaten Mask, how many links do you make them block? Are you making them block 3s and 4s, or is it only 3s? The 3s is easier. If you have a 3-card hand, they only need to block the last link. So if your turn is like 3-3-5, that's pretty good. If it's 3-3-3, they can give you 1 card, and that is a lot less pressure. And so you're often trying to balance this. And a good heuristic for this deck is, especially if you've already drawn off Mask, you really want to get an Arsenal, because that lets you push Mask again in the future, and arsenaling starters really helps with our consistency. One of the nice things about this deck is, we do have all the draconic starters. You have some like pseudo draconic starters, like you have Ravenous Rabble. This isn't draconic, but if we have fealties, we can make that into draconic, so we have some redundancy there. You can also do things like Rabble into Blaze Headlong, and since you played a red, it gets go again, and then you have your first draconic chain link, which enables all your Lava Vein loyalty style effects. So that's literally Lava Vein loyalty, but also Burning Blade Dance and Hot on the Heels. These, if you control 2 or more draconic chain links, they get go again, and some of them have additional effects. So you're kind of trying to play out your turn this way. Ideally, you always have the draconic starter, but inevitably, sometimes you won't. And when you won't, or when you don't, you can pitch a red to swing your kunai. And this feels kind of bad. Pitching a whole card to swing for 1 doesn't feel great, but the thing is that typically you only lose about 2 value, because most of your starters are head jabs, meaning they come in for 3, kunai comes in for 1, and most of the time, you still need to do the math on your turn, but most of the time your turn still converts pretty good. So even if you had a hand of 4 Lava Vein loyalties, you could just like block for 12 or block for 9, swing 3, those are all things that the hand can do. But if you have tempo, you can also pitch one of them, swing a dagger for 1, then play out all your Lava Vein loyalties, 3, 3, 3, and then you can also flick knives. So that's a total of 10 damage, plus the flick is 11 damage, and you need them to block 2 chain links to block out Mask, which is actually a lot of pressure. And that's kind of like the floor on your hands. If you end up having like a 4 in there, you have a 12. If you end up having a 5 in there, like maybe you have a lava burst, you can also do like a 13 damage turn. So just because you don't have a starter doesn't mean that your hand's not functional. In fact, the deck is very, very consistent because of the kunais being onboard starters. That basically means when we have our kunais, we really want to make sure that we always have one so that we have that on-demand starter. We can pretty freely flick once, even if we're not going to get our kunai back, because we aren't really planning to swing our kunais all that much. But going down to 0 kunais is a real cost. So 1 kunai, we don't really feel it that much. 0 kunais, yes, we do feel that, because if we don't have a starter coming up, we're in trouble. Fealties help with that. Having a starter in Arsenal helps with that. Sometimes information from Rabble help with that. So there's spots where you can go to 0 kunais, but just be careful. So that's kind of the idea behind the deck. Besides the starters and building your chains and placing on hits in awkward spots for Mask of Momentum, we have a couple of different like categories of resources that the deck cares about. So the first one is literal resources or cost reduction. So we have Blood Splattered Vest on demand to let us play our 1 costs in the form of Art of the Dragonfire. This is probably one of our most premium ones. If we combine it with our other resource Fealty, we get a 1 for 7, which if we flick and don't pay for it, it's a 0 for 7. Very, very good. Breaking Point as a effectively 0 for 5. So this is kind of like a lava burst with upside. It doesn't need 3 chain links to be active, to have the 5 power active. But the rupture effect is really strong, especially if you can get your opponent to block Mask earlier in the chain. So if they spend 2 cards blocking out Mask and then you end on Breaking Point, it can be a bit of a blowout. So Breaking Point, really, really, really impressive. And Take the Tempo being a very similar card to Breaking Point, where it comes in as a 1 for 5. It's not draconic, so sometimes that can be a little bit more tricky. It conflicts with cards like Oath, but yeah, Take the Tempo, really good. And an interesting thing about Take the Tempo is it just looks for 3 hits, not 3 chain links. So 1 attack hitting and then Take the Tempo hitting and Flick Knives is 3 hits. 1 from the first attack, 1 from Take the Tempo, 1 from Flick Knives, and that would be enough to trigger Take the Tempo. So it's actually a slightly easier condition to trigger than Mask of Momentum. It also doesn't have to be in a row. So Take the Tempo's on hit is pretty potent, and it is really kind of like another Breaking Point style effect. So yeah, Take the Tempo, pretty impressive. Other finishers, we have Hunt the Hunter. It being Draconic matters, it giving us Mark and Fealty, effectively Fealty, because whenever Cindra hits a hero, and they're marked, she gets a Fealty. So this is a Fealty generator, and the Fealty generators are really, really important. So those are kind of like all the finishers we're cheating out. We can cheat them out with the Blood Splattered Vest. We can cheat them out with Art of the Dragon Blood. If we Fealty it, it will allow us to play things for free. So this becomes pretty much the best starter in the deck. You can use it as just a 0 for 4 chain ender, but once you get Fealties, it becomes the best starter in the deck. And that's because it comes in for 4 and it gives everything cost reduction, which is just really, really powerful. So you can use that to cheat out some of your other 1 costs. Some of them require Fealty. So if you want to do like Art of Dragon Blood, Art of Dragon Fire, that takes 2 Fealty to do, which is expensive, but very powerful. So this is another way we can make resources and not actually pay for our cards. Drop of Dragon Blood is, once again, another way to do this. Rising Resentment, if it hits on our second chain link, can banish a 1 cost. On our second Draconic chain link, it can banish a 1 cost, and then we can play it for free. Which is another like little mini game for our opponent. Do we care about the cost reduction? Do we not care about the cost reduction? You can sort of play some mind games with your opponent, sequence your attacks in ways where you try to encourage them to block when it's beneficial for you. That's part of the deck. So she's very tricky. And then we have Ignite, probably one of the most premium starters as well. This comes in for 2. And it makes our next Draconic card that we play or activate, which includes Fealty, Cindra ability, Dragon Scalar Flight Path. It makes them cost 1 less, the next thing that we do. So yeah, Ignite, really, really important for allowing us to play these finishers. And basically the idea is if we have some of our cost reducers, we can save on our Blood Splattered Vest resources, and when it doesn't line up, we can use Blood Splattered Vest as insurance. The last thing I'll mention is Yellow Brand with Cinderclaw. If you play this out, it's worth 2, but you can also swing a dagger and then pay for a 1 cost with it, which gives you 1 on the 1 cost, and then you get an extra resource. 1 on the dagger and 1 for the extra resource. So you're really only losing 1 value by pitching a yellow-brown with Cinderclaw instead of playing it. So yeah, that's like totally fine and something that you're sometimes pretty happy to do. It's really contextual. If you don't have fealty, you might care about this saving you on fealty. If you have lots of fealty, but you're getting low on blood splattered vest resources, you might care more about conserving the blood splattered vest. So there's like a little bit of give and take there, and brand sort of functions as both. So yellow brand is like a bit of a glue piece for the deck. So yeah, cost reducers are a big thing to help us play our finishers that we talked about. In terms of fealty makers, we have 5 literal fealty makers. So display loyalty is our most premium one. This costs 0. It's sort of like a lava vein loyalty, but it blocks 2. Just uninteractable fealty generation, really good. It's on rate, fantastic. Demonstrate devotion's the same idea, but it has a leg tap stat line. Again, it needs the second chain link. Demonstrate devotion can be a little bit clunky. I think that overall, though, you need to run this card. This card, we don't really want to pay for by pitching, but we can pay for it with any of our cost reducers, so it works well with Ignite. It's kind of best friends with Art of the Dragon Blood because you can spend the fealty on Art of Dragon Blood, then you can demonstrate devotion, get the cost reduction, and get your fealty back, and then maybe even play another 1 cost later on in the turn. So demonstrate devotion pretty strong for all of that. It's also fine to pitch a brand with Cinderclaw to pay for demonstrate devotion. That can happen too. But ultimately, we just kind of need the fealty generators, and demonstrate devotion checks enough boxes. But because it is clunky is why it's a 2 of. Hunt the Hunter we talked about, again, another fealty generator and pretty much uninteractable. Once they're marked, you can flick to get the fealty, so that's really, really good. And then technically, we also have Hot on their heels. This is on hit mark, so your opponent does get to interact with this, but your opponent can't always afford to block everything out, so they have to make some judgment calls about if they wanted to deny you the mark or not. And yeah, another way you can get fealty. Finally, Brand with Cinderclaw. Not actually fealty generation, but can be used in place with fealty. And yeah, I think that like balancing your fealty and draconic enablers versus your resource reducers is like one of the most important things in the deck and something that's really interesting to do. So you kind of need to figure out like, if I have lots of fealty, maybe I need to conserve on my resources, or if I have lots of resources but no fealty, maybe I can like try to really make sure I am playing out these fealty makers, or arsenaling my brand with Cinderclaw so I have them when I need them. Those kinds of decisions that are really important. So yeah, those are kind of the main types of cards in the deck. We have the fealty makers, reducers, we have our draconic starters, and then we just have some extenders. So there's a whole bunch of extenders like the lava vein loyalties, and then we end on a finisher. What is Dragon Scalar Flight Path doing in the deck? Well, Dragon Scalar Flight Path is primarily there to allow us to play double ender. So you can do things like play out a Lava Burst turn. So I don't know, maybe we go Brand with Cinderclaw, Rabble, Blaze Headlong, Lava Burst, and then we can flick at some point, get the resource, Dragon Scalar Flight Path, Breaking Point. That's an example line that we could be doing. So it doesn't really matter which finishers, but double finisher is what Dragon Scalar Flight Path is there for. It also lets us continue extending if we have an arsenal and end on a 1 for 5. If our opponent decides they don't want to block and give us the mass trigger because the 5's hard to break out, hard to block out, then we can perhaps keep going. So that is sort of the idea there. The other use for Dragon Scalar Flight Path is Wrath of Retribution. So we haven't talked about this. This is kind of like this is a power card. It's an extender. It needs a big hand. Ideally, we're playing 3 Draconic Chain Links before this. It costs 0. Then we have both our daggers up already. We swing the dagger for 2. We swing the dagger for 2. We can flick a dagger, and this is basically a 0 for 7 with Go Again, which is really good. If we have our Dragon Scalar Flight Paths, we can activate it on one of the daggers. That lets us swing the dagger an additional time, and that will give us another 2. So this will be a 0 for 9. Typically, if you've already blocked with your Dragon Scalar Flight Path, cashing it in on a dagger swing for Wrath of Retribution is pretty worth it. Just getting the free 2 value out of it when it lines up is really, really good. Something to note about this card is you can use fealty to help you get to this cost reduction. So if you have a hand that's like 2 draconics and a rabble, you can fealty the rabble to get the cost reduction. Flicking to get the cost reduction is usually not so good because you go down a dagger. I usually like to end my turn with a dagger after Wrath. There are spots where you just need to push damage and you'll go off your daggers, and that's okay. But typically I like ending with a dagger if I can. I think it's like a more conservative and a more consistent line. So that's another interaction to consider. And then you can also double up cost reduction. So if you go like Oath into Ignite, you have 2 draconic chain links, Wrath is reduced by 2, and then Ignite reduces it by an additional 1 because of the ability. So you can play it on your 3rd chain link with Ignite, and the same thing holds true for Art of Dragonblood. So that's kind of how to use Wrath of Retribution. Should be pretty much everything for the main deck besides Ancestral Empowerment. We haven't talked about this card. This is a bit of a power card for us. So Ancestral Empowerment gives target ninja attack action card +1 and lets us draw a card at reaction speed, no less. In combination with Flick Knives, this is really, really nasty for pushing through on hits. Typically, we want to do this on the hit that would be triggering Mask. So our opponent, blocks out a 3 with a card, and that one's going to trigger Mask. Then we can Ancestral Empowerment, bump it 1 over, draw a card, and this can lead to huge, huge blowouts. So Empowerment is very much a power card in this deck. I'm currently on the fence about running a 3rd one of these. I think that there is a real world where the 3rd Empowerment is the way to go. It is a little bit clunky though. It requiring ninja attack action cards is like relevant. You have draconic cards here, you have some generics like Ravenous Rabble, so that is relevant. And perhaps more importantly, it's not really a starter. You kind of need a big hand to utilize it. If you draw a handful of Ancestral Empowerments and Chain Enders, it really doesn't function very well. So this card has like a little bit of inherent clunkiness. Additionally, this card interferes with, or maybe not interferes, it conflicts with Oath of Loyalty. Oath says we can only play draconic cards for this turn and have to play it as our first action. So it's bad both in the, if we draw an Oath off of Ancestral, it's problematic, but it's also bad if we play an Oath at the start of our turn and we want to Ancestral. We can fealty the Ancestral to get around it, but that's kind of expensive and not necessarily what we always want to be doing. So there is a little bit of like inherent conflict between these cards and all the Chain Enders. So yeah, feel free to play around with the ratios, but I found that this number of Chain Enders is like pretty much right. You start adding 1 or 2 more, it gets clunky pretty quickly. Similarly, I think the number of fealty makers is about right. If you drop a fealty maker and add a fealty payoff like Dragon Power, you actually feel it. You're kind of low on fealty. And there are games where you just like run away with a whole bunch of fealty and you have more than you need. But there's usually a nice problem to have. And sometimes it lets you avoid pitching to Kunai and just making a Draconic starter with something like Fire Tenant Strike First instead. I guess we didn't talk about this card also. Fire Tenant Strike First is not a reaction the way Ancestral Empowerment is, but it has a similar function for pushing through Mask. We can use this to kind of like place a breakpoint. So if we have a bunch of head jabs, we can go like head jab, Fire Tenant first Strike First, and then our next Draconic gets +1, and we can send in maybe like a Hot on their heels for 4 to threaten Mask with an on hit. And that's really powerful. So Fire Tenant also really premium and sort of reminds me of Ancestral, where this one's a little more flexible because yes, it's not Draconic, but it is like a red go again. It's a head jab. It's a 0 for 4, and yeah, just very solid. Let's see. I think that is pretty much the main deck. I guess I'm going to touch on Blood Runs Deep really briefly. I think that Blood Runs Deep is perhaps a little bit... It looks like a power card, but honestly, I haven't been too impressed with this card. You're wanting to flick basically every turn. So when you Blood Runs Deep, if you flick on a previous chain link, then you flick on Blood Runs Deep. It's really good for pushing mass because it means they can't block. But this is basically like a 0 for 3 that's hard to block. And you need 2 draconic chain links before it to make it cost 0. So it's like a very conditional head jab that it does push mask, but it's not great. So I think that this is a card that could look to be replaced. I used to be on more copies of this card, and I've cut it down and down and down. And now it's down to 1, and I could see going to 0 potentially. Maybe for an Ancestral Empowerment is something that I've been experimenting with, but I haven't made up my mind. So that's pretty much the main deck. We can talk quickly about the sideboard. It's pretty simple sideboard. Arcane Lantern is here just as Kano Hate in combination with Spellfray Leggings. We don't really have resource cards in this deck. Everything's pretty much red. We have 57 reds and 3 blues, so we are not looking to pitch to AB with Arcane Lantern. The entire reason of this is for Kano, because ABing Wildfire is really good, and our equipment is kind of too important. We talked about how Mask of Momentum, Flick Knives, and Blood Splattered Vest really make our deck hum. We can't really cut any of those. We can get the Spellfray 1 boots, and then turns out that we can actually give a kunai. Being, I kind of mentioned, being on only 1 kunai is acceptable, being on 0 kunais is not. So giving up the kunai for Arcane Lantern is actually pretty good into Kano. Something you can do against Kano is you can draw resources from Blood Splattered Vest really aggressively because the game tends to be really short. So you can just float a resource even if you're not planning to use it and have that as an extra way to AB if they are threatening to kill you. So that's something to be aware of. Just make sure you're still using Flick Knives to pressure mask as well. So do the timing carefully. If you've already flicked and you want to keep going and they haven't blocked, like let's say you're going to trigger mask and they haven't blocked, that can be a good time to kunai, get that resource, and just make sure to insulate yourself a bit before you commit. But that's the idea behind the AB and the Spellfray. Warmongers, this is here for Viserai and Azalea. We're a pretty good Warmongers user. We go very, very wide. It's pretty nasty that we can even end on a finisher, give it go again, and then play Warmongers. This card's also good into Vinset if Vinset ends up being popular. So yeah, not too much to say about Warmongers, just a good hate piece for a few decks. But yeah, having so much damage and go again makes Warmongers really good. And if your opponent commits to like letting you have your mask trigger and you hit them a whole bunch, then you end on Warmongers, it is pretty backbreaking. I've definitely won some games in that manner. So pretty impressed with this card in this deck. And then we have 9 D-Reacts for a variety of different matchups. Waxons are really nice into Aurora and some of your ninjas, as well as Assassin. Just 0/5/5 D-React, really good. I think this is not really a surprise to anybody. Zen has been making very good use of this card. It's kind of no different for us. Shelter from the Storm, the newest 0/4 D-React. You could consider playing Sinks. I think Shelter is a little bit better. Has some implications if you want to play it in the mirror. I'm leaning towards playing D-Reacts in the mirror, but haven't made up my mind. There's sort of like a lot to test, and yeah, there's some things to consider, but I think that Shelters potentially has some implications in the mirror, and it has a lot of implications into the Arachnes that are relying on Flick Knives to mark you and do some crazy lines with Take Up the Mantle and things like this. You can really shut them down. Or if they pitch to a dagger for 1, you can really shut them down with Shelter, in addition to just being a 0/4 D-React. So Shelter is just very multi-purpose and very powerful. So I've been impressed with this card. And then a card I haven't seen too many people talk about, but I think is really good, is Loyalty Beyond the Grave. On its face, this is just an evasive leap, so this is a 0/3 draconic defense reaction with no additional text when you play it. Not super exciting. What is exciting though is that when this is in your graveyard, at the start of your turn, you can banish 2 cards named Loyalty Beyond the Grave, so you have to have played 2 of them. Then you can banish those 2, and if you do, you draw a card. Notably, this is a May, so once you have 2 loyalties in your graveyard, you can just go ahead and cash them in right away. And sometimes that's the thing that you'll do to maintain pressure, and that's fine. That's pretty good because you basically like block 6 out of essentially 1 card because you spent 2 cards, but you got a card back. So 1 card block 6 is great. And the other thing that is powerful about this though is that because you get to choose when you do it, you can either like play towards having a 5-card hand and then Loyalty Beyond the Grave to have a 6-card hand, which is really impactful, or you can potentially use it and let's say you have a Lava Burst, but your hand is I don't know, Rising Resentment, Ravenous Rabble, Lava Burst, and you can't quite get to that Lava Burst chain link to get the Rupture, and you really want to. Well, you can cash in a loyalty on that turn, and then it's worth a little bit extra, because even if you, let's say you low roll, you get a Chain Ender, you can always at least pitch to Dagger, or maybe you can go like 3-4, flick, get a resource for Hunt the Hunter, play Hunt the Hunter, boots, Lava Burst, and go about it that way. So pretty much no matter what you draw, you'll be able to enable that Lava Burst, and that can be a good spot to draw a card as well. So yeah, just know that you have a lot of flexibility with when to cash in loyalty, and I think that that's a really big strength of the card. Yeah, so that's pretty much everything I've got to say about the Redline Cindra deck. I think this is a great deck if you like asking your opponents tricky questions, if you want to, make them have tough blocking decisions and think about like how they block and where to put your breakpoints. There's a lot to unpack with Cindra. At the same time, if you're new to Flesh and Blood, I have some friends just picking up the game for the first time. Cindra is a great deck to pick up and play because her hands play out. They have lots of go again. She's pretty intuitive, and I think that she's easy enough to pick up and play. So I think that there's like kind of a lot of people that this deck will appeal to. Additionally, it just blocks pretty well. Has a lot of 3 blocks. Has some 2 blocks for sure, but the deck blocks surprisingly well, especially with the D-reacts. Your clunky hands basically always block. Your hands pretty much always convert on offense. So yeah, Cindra just like very consistent, very stable aggro deck with a lot of play to it on both sides. Honestly, I know some people have found Cindra a little bit like of a nuisance or a little bit frustrating to play against, but I think the more you play against her, the more interesting she is to play against. There's quite a bit of back and forth on both sides, which has been a lot of fun. I can maybe really briefly discuss maybe board for cards that aren't in here that could be in here. Dragon Power is another 1 for 7. This was in the deck. It's another card that needs fealty. The floor of the 1 for 4 is pretty bad. Sometimes you can play the other ones as 1 for 5s, and that's kind of acceptable, but the 1 for 4 is pretty unexciting. It is really good at pushing Mask when he comes in for 7, but overall, like I played one of these in Memphis and I've since cut it. It's fine, not great, but you could play 1 to 2 of these. The third Demonstrate Devotion we kind of talked about gets a little too clunky. Hunt the Hunter is a card I've been impressed with and considered going up on, but you just have so many premium chain enders that it has a lot of competition. Compounding Anger is a card that looks great and looks like maybe even a better Lava Burst, but needing 3 Draconic actually matters for the purposes of stuff like you have like Rabble and Fire Tenet strike first in the deck, so those don't work towards Compounding Anger. And a lot of times it's just like a 1 for 5 that you have to work for. Not really great, so it's an okay chain ender, but I think I actually like Hunt the Hunter more than I like Compounding Anger. Bloodline, kind of analogous to Blood Runs Deep. You need 2 Draconic chain links. Fine, not super exciting. Hunt to the Ends of Wraith is another Draconic starter, although a not very exciting one, but it is good Arachne hate, so if you have a lot of Arachne in your meta, you can run this card. It's fine. Sink Below is fine. Oasis could be like additional Kano hate if you really wanted it. I know, I believe Jacob Baugh's list in Battle-Hardened Memphis was somewhat similar. Drew some inspiration from the list that Brodie and I played for that event on the Calling weekend, on the days prior to that. But yeah, Snatch could be a card in. If you're running Snatch, I think you need Snaps, and you again run into the problem of there's just like too many good chain enders, but Snatch is a pretty good card at punishing your opponents for blocking out Mask on earlier chain links. You end on Snatch, you get the card draw anyways. It's the same idea as Breaking Point and Take the Tempo, so similar kind of card there. If you want another non-draconic head jab, Tag the Target is an option. This gives you more potential mark, which is something pretty good. Something to consider there. Maybe it's kind of like part of a draconic head jab, because if you mark them, then you can make another starter later draconic. So it's like not a draconic starter, but sort of helps with that a little bit. I'm not sure. If I was going to run a blue starter, it'd be Blue Brand. I don't think this card's quite good enough, but you could consider it. It's just sort of like if you play out a Blue Brand and then you get your Art of the Dragonfire, it's like you lost 2 value by playing the Blue Brand, and then you make it up on the Art of the Dragonfire by getting the +2, but like then you're no longer above rate, and it's not super exciting. So it's a resource card. It's okay. It is a starter, but I don't think it's really great. Then finally, Throw Daggers. I think Throw Daggers is largely worse than Ancestral Empowerment. And I think that if you want, you can play a list that is a little bit more low to the ground and plays more Throw Daggers in place of more starters. The trade-offs of this is basically your mask gets harder to deny because you have Empowerment and Throw Dagger as ways to push your mask trigger repeatedly down the line. And it's a very similar effect. 1 damage, draw a card. There are some downsides though. Those downsides include you still have all the conflicts with Oath that I talked about in the same way that Ancestral does. So you can, it doesn't work on your Oath turn. It doesn't work if you draw Oath of it. That's awkward. It has some weakness to Shelter from the Storm. If it's prevented, you technically can always Flick Knives first, and usually your opponent will discard Shelter to Flick Knives if they're going to discard Shelter at all. So you do have some insulation from it in that way, but can be a little bit awkward. And then, yeah, just ultimately, like, there's a limit to how many of these reactions and finishers you can really run. And I really like all of our Chain Enders. So you can be a deck that pushes Mask in a more frustrating way and is better at drawing off Mask. But the exchange is you have less of these above rate Chain Enders to help you kind of like go over. Because if all we're doing is like 3s and 4s, our math is very consistent and very good, but not super exciting. And I think that these 1 for 5s and even 1 for 7s really add to the deck's ceiling. So that's sort of like what I would say is there's a bit of a trade-off there. I found it really hard to fit this card, but I have seen some people playing this, and I do get it. It's a powerful effect, but not sure it's where I would go for the current metagame. Maybe the last card that is not in the maybe board, but could be, is Art of the Dragon Scale. So Art of the Dragon Scale says, when this attacks, if it's draconic, it gets, when this hits a hero, put a -1 counter on equipment they control. If it has 0 defense, destroy it. This has some implications, especially into the Cindra mirror, where you can blow up Flick Knives is probably the equipment to target with this, because that essentially shuts off the chess piece and makes their mask still functional, but a lot worse. So Art of the Dragon Scales is a good piece of equipment hate. That being said, you need to find this card early. Because if you find it late in the game and then you target their Flick Knives, it's kind of low impact. So you need to find this early. You also need to find the fealty with it. And there's a question of like, do you have the time to find this in the mirror? I had actually originally tested this into the Flick Knives Ira deck that was running Zephyr Needles, and I just found it to be a little bit too slow. So I don't know. Verdict's out on this one. I need to test it a little bit into the mirror. I think you could run a couple. I don't think I'd run 3. I think I like our other starters more, but this could be a card to include, and I believe was included in Sean's Calling Christchurch winning deck list. I think he had 1 or 2 copies of this. Lists aren't published yet, but I know he mentioned in an interview that he had this card in the deck. So this is another potential card, one to keep an eye on as well. Like if there's a really powerful piece of equipment that is vulnerable to this, it becomes a pretty good hate card, but I'm not sure I like it in the mirror. Ultimately, people can just block this out if they really need to. Getting them to block is pretty good, but yeah, I don't know. I'm not sold on it. I've also gotten questions about this card. Art of the Dragon Claw is another breaking point. I think it not being draconic and requiring the fealty to get the effect is just like a pretty big deal. I've tried this card and it's okay. You have better Chain Enders. I'd much rather just run Take the Tempo. You have a similar on hit. It costs a card. Like you gain a card instead of they lose a card, but similar amount of value. And yeah, it's also non-draconic, but it doesn't require a fealty to do the thing. So Take the Tempo is like more impressive to me than Art of Dragon Claw. So I'd be running more Take the Tempos before I would run more Art of the Dragon Claws. But yeah, that's going to be a wrap. So that's pretty much everything you need to know about this deck list. And thank you so much for watching. Please consider commenting, and subscribing if you enjoyed this video. We'll see you all next time. Bye for now.